Lucia Moreno had never imagined that peace could feel so tangible until she moved into her little cottage at the edge of Willow Creek Estates. The house wasn't grand or modern like the others that lined the cul-de-sac with their polished fences and identical lawns, but it had something those houses didn't: soul. The garden behind it had been nothing but dry, uneven soil when she bought the place, yet she saw in it a promise. Every weekend she worked the earth with her bare hands, kneeling under the sun, planting rows of basil, tomatoes, strawberries, and lavender. The scent of the soil mixed with the faint sweetness of herbs reminded her of her grandmother's home in Mexico, where she had spent endless summers learning that patience could grow beauty. For Lucia, that small patch of green was more than a hobby. It was therapy, her quiet rebellion against years of instability, a place where she could finally breathe without fear. Her daughter Sophia loved it too. She would dance between the rows of plants, her laughter rising with the hum of bees. The garden became a sanctuary for both of them, a symbol of recovery after the storm. The neighborhood itself seemed perfect at first glance, though there was something sterile about its perfection. Every hedge was trimmed to the exact same height, every door painted one of 3 approved shades of beige. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, kept everything immaculate, and at first Lucia thought that was reassuring. But she soon realized that this so-called order came with eyes that never stopped watching. She felt it the first time she caught the neighbor, a woman named Karen Whitfield, standing at the edge of her property, arms crossed, her face frozen in polite disdain. Karen was the kind of person who wore perfume even to fetch the mail, who believed that control was a virtue and uniformity a sign of civilization. The first time they met, she smiled too widely and introduced herself as head of the HOA's Landscaping Compliance Committee. Lucia, still naive about how these communities worked, returned the smile, unaware that the woman was already assessing her garden like a problem waiting to be corrected. Weeks passed peacefully, until the first comment arrived. "You know," Karen said one morning, her voice coated with honey but her eyes sharp as glass, "vegetable gardens aren't exactly encouraged here. The bylaws call it unapproved agricultural use." Lucia laughed softly, thinking it was a joke, but Karen didn't laugh back. That was the first time something inside Lucia's chest tensed. She explained gently that it was just a few herbs and berries, all neatly kept, but Karen simply nodded and left without another word. From that moment, the air between their houses grew heavier. Lucia began to notice Karen's car parked longer near her driveway, the blinds of her window shifting when Lucia worked outside. Once, when Lucia came home late, she found a neatly folded note tucked under her door, reminding her that shared spaces must reflect community standards. There was no signature, but the perfume on the paper told her everything she needed to know. Still, Lucia tried to ignore it. She wanted to believe that hostility could be softened with kindness, that good intentions were enough to disarm malice. She continued tending to her plants, teaching Sophia how to water them carefully and talk to them as if they were friends. But the feeling of being watched never left her. At night, when the sprinklers whispered across the grass and the lights from neighboring houses blinked out one by one, she sometimes glanced through her curtains and thought she saw a shadow moving near the fence, a still silhouette that vanished when she blinked. It might have been her imagination, she told herself, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Something in Karen's gaze that first day had promised trouble, the kind that starts with a whisper and ends like a storm tearing through everything you've built. By late summer, the garden was thriving, a wild mosaic of green and color that contrasted sharply with the sterile lawns around it. Lucia took pride in it. It was proof that life could flourish even in a place ruled by control. Yet she could sense the resentment it stirred. Karen's smiles grew colder. Her tone clipped whenever they crossed paths. And one morning, as Lucia watered the basil, she heard Karen's voice from her side of the fence, soft, but clear enough to pierce the quiet. "Some people just don't understand the meaning of rules," she said to no one in particular. The hose slipped from Lucia's hand, spraying water across her shoes. In that moment, she realized peace in Willow Creek had never truly belonged to her. It was borrowed, and someone was already trying to take it back. It began with the smell. A faint, chemical bitterness that lingered above the soil one quiet morning as Lucia stepped into the garden with her cup of coffee. The air was heavy, still, yet beneath the fragrance of lavender and damp earth was something acrid, artificial, wrong. She crouched near the tomato patch, brushing the leaves gently, and noticed how several plants had started to curl inward overnight, their stems blackening near the base. At first, she blamed the heat, or maybe the sprinkler system, but then her fingers brushed against a cluster of white granules scattered across the ground, tiny crystalline pellets glistening under the sun. Fertilizer? No. She hadn't used anything of the sort. Lucia felt her chest tighten as an uneasy realization crept in. Something had been spread deliberately. The idea was absurd, and yet, when she lifted her gaze, she saw movement by the fence. Karen stood there in her pastel cardigan, pretending to trim a bush that didn't need trimming, her eyes flicking toward Lucia's dying plants before turning away with practiced indifference. Lucia didn't say a word. She simply stared until Karen retreated. Then she collected a sample of the strange substance in a plastic bag. The rest of the day felt distorted, her thoughts looping between disbelief and dread. Who would poison a garden? What kind of person would do that? And why? By evening, she had driven to a local environmental lab, her voice trembling as she asked them to analyze the sample. The technician promised results within 48 hours, but those 2 days dragged like weeks. Each morning, she found another patch of wilted leaves, another area of soil turned ashen and dry. Sophia asked why the strawberries looked sick, and Lucia lied, saying the weather had been cruel this year. She smiled for her daughter's sake, but behind that smile was growing anger, the kind that trembles under the skin before it bursts. The report arrived by email late on a Wednesday night. Lucia opened it at the kitchen table while the clock ticked past midnight. The document was clinical, sterile, and yet its words hit like a blow. Presence of carbamate pesticide compound, illegal for residential use. The sample contained a toxic concentration of a chemical banned nearly a decade ago for its impact on wildlife and children. Her garden hadn't just been poisoned. It had been contaminated with intent. Lucia's first instinct was to go to the HOA. She believed, perhaps foolishly, that logic and evidence would make them act. The next morning, she printed the report and walked to the HOA office near the community gatehouse, a sleek building with frosted windows and an artificial smile plastered across its receptionist's face. The meeting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Across the table sat 2 board members, including Karen, who wore her authority like armor. Lucia laid the report before them, explaining what had happened, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. Karen skimmed the first page, then leaned back with a soft sigh. "Ms. Moreno," she began, tone dripping with condescension, "this community maintains strict regulations about acceptable landscaping materials. If your garden was affected, it might be due to unapproved substances you've used yourself. Organic fertilizers, for instance, can attract pests, and the HOA has a responsibility to protect neighboring properties." Lucia blinked in disbelief. "You're implying I did this to my own plants?" she asked. Karen's smile never faltered. "I'm saying we can't rule anything out. We'll have our environmental committee review the issue." One of the men at the table added, "Please refrain from making accusations without proof of wrongdoing." Proof. She had lab results, dying plants, and the faint odor of poison in her backyard. What more did they need? Lucia left the meeting feeling humiliated, her anger smoldering beneath the surface. As she stepped outside, she saw Karen speaking in hushed tones to another board member, her laughter sharp and brittle like broken glass. That evening, Lucia found a letter taped to her door, an official HOA notice citing her for non-compliant landscaping practices and potential violation of aesthetic uniformity standards. The fine was small, but the message was clear. They weren't just dismissing her, they were turning the blame against her. For the first time since moving in, she felt genuine fear, not just for her garden, but for her safety. Days later, the situation worsened. The basil plants shriveled entirely, leaving behind a patch of dead earth. The cat, a gentle gray stray Sophia had adopted months earlier, began vomiting and refused to eat. Within 24 hours, it was gone. Lucia buried it beneath the oak tree at dawn, her hands trembling as she pressed the soil back into place. That was the breaking point. Her grief hardened into resolve. She went to the local police department, carrying the lab report and photos of the garden. The officer on duty listened politely, but seemed detached, taking notes with the slow indifference of someone who'd already decided how this story would end. "You suspect your neighbor did this?" he asked. "I don't suspect," she said. "I know." He sighed, scratching his pen against the pad. "Do you have footage or witnesses?" When she admitted she didn't, he shook his head gently. "Without direct evidence, there's not much we can do. These HOA disputes can get messy. I suggest installing cameras." That night, Lucia stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The fence gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere beyond it, she imagined Karen smiling to herself, certain she'd won again. But Lucia wasn't going to surrender. She ordered a set of motion-activated cameras the next morning, hiding them among the flower pots and trellises. Each beep of the setup confirmed her new reality. She was no longer tending a garden. She was preparing for war. For days, she watched and waited, going about her routine as if nothing had changed. Then one evening, just after midnight, a faint rustling drew her attention. She crept to the window, heart pounding, and saw a shadow moving near the fence. The cameras caught the flicker of motion. A figure crouched low, arm extended over the soil, scattering something from a small bag. The porch light snapped on, and for a split second, Karen's face turned toward the glow, pale and startled, before she bolted into the night. Lucia watched the footage again and again, every frame burning the image deeper into her mind. She didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, she sent copies of the video to the police and the HOA board, attaching the lab report once more. There was no more ambiguity, no room for denial. Karen had crossed a line that could never be undone. Yet as Lucia stared at the wilting remnants of her garden, she couldn't shake the chilling thought that this wasn't about bylaws or community standards. It was something darker, rooted in envy, prejudice, and the quiet thrill some people feel when they watch something pure decay. The garden that once represented peace had become the battleground for control, and somewhere deep down, Lucia knew the real fight was only beginning. The morning after sending the footage, Lucia woke to silence so deep it felt deliberate, as though the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The usual sound of sprinklers and children's bicycles had vanished, replaced by the hollow echo of her own footsteps across the porch. She brewed coffee but didn't drink it. Her stomach turned each time she thought of the video. She had imagined that once she sent it, everything would shift, that the truth would pierce the calm veneer of Willow Creek and force someone, anyone, to act. Yet when she opened her email, there was nothing. No acknowledgement from the HOA, no response from the police, not even an automated confirmation. The footage existed, undeniable and clear, but it was as if the community had swallowed it whole. By noon, she could feel eyes on her again. The same blinds she'd seen fluttering weeks ago were half drawn now, a sliver of shadow shifting behind them. When she went outside to check the mail, Karen's car was parked at the curb, polished to perfection, its engine idling though no one was inside. A single envelope sat in the mailbox, bearing the HOA logo once more. Inside, a short letter informed her that the alleged incident was under review, and until further notice, She was to refrain from making defamatory statements about any resident. Defamatory. The word stung. Her evidence had been turned against her again, twisted into another threat. Beneath the formal language was a quieter message. Keep silent. Lucia tore the letter in half and threw it into the trash, her hands trembling not from fear anymore but from fury. That evening, she tried to explain everything to Sophia without terrifying her. She kept her tone light, saying that they'd had some trouble with a neighbor who didn't like their garden, but that the police were helping. Sophia, bright-eyed and perceptive beyond her years, only asked, "Are we safe, Mama?" The question hit harder than any accusation could. Lucia nodded, but her voice failed her, and the nod became a lie. The next morning, she discovered one of her cameras smashed against the ground. The casing was cracked, the memory card missing. Nearby, muddy footprints trailed toward the fence, ending where the soil had been disturbed. Someone had been there again. She rushed to check the others, heart pounding, but 2 more were gone. The only camera that remained was the one she had hidden inside a hanging flower basket near the kitchen window. When she played back its footage, she saw only glimpses, shadows moving under the moonlight, the faint outline of a figure crouching low, and then darkness as the camera went dead. It was no coincidence. Whoever came that night knew exactly where to look. Lucia printed copies of the damaged camera photos and went straight to the HOA office again. Karen wasn't there this time, but the secretary at the front desk barely met her eyes. When Lucia asked to speak to the president of the board, she was told he was unavailable for unscheduled complaints. She demanded they at least review the security footage from the community gates, since only residents could enter after hours, but the woman behind the desk simply repeated the policy like a machine. Access to HOA surveillance is restricted to internal review. The words were sterile, designed to suffocate any further protest. Lucia left shaking with frustration. She felt trapped in a loop of bureaucracy and denial, a system built not to protect her, but to exhaust her into silence. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she noticed several neighbors standing near the end of the street, whispering. When she walked closer, the whispers stopped. One of them, a man who used to wave at her every morning, turned his back abruptly. Another crossed the road without a glance. She realized then that Karen's influence had already spread. Lies moved faster than truth here. Maybe Karen had told them she was unstable, dramatic, a troublemaker. Maybe she didn't have to say anything at all. The HOA's silence was endorsement enough. Later that night, a new letter appeared on her door. This one was printed on official stationery, cold and precise. It accused her of violating community standards by installing unauthorized surveillance equipment visible from neighboring properties, and threatened fines if she didn't remove them within 72 hours. Lucia laughed bitterly as she read it, the sound sharp and hollow in the quiet house. So that was it. Their response to being caught was to punish her for catching them. She tore the notice down and shoved it into a drawer, unwilling to give it another second of her energy. But when she looked outside, she noticed Karen standing once again by the fence, phone in hand, snapping a photo of her house before disappearing into the dark. The days that followed were a blur of tension. Every time Lucia stepped outside, she felt the invisible weight of scrutiny. She began noticing small changes meant to unnerve her. Her trash cans overturned and scattered across the driveway, her mailbox left open with its contents drenched by the sprinklers, a single dead bird placed at the edge of the garden bed. One morning, she found her name scrawled in chalk on the sidewalk with the word liar beneath it. Sophia saw it too, and for the first time she was afraid to go outside. Lucia scrubbed the words away while her daughter watched silently from the porch, and when she finished, she realized her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the cloth. Still, she refused to be cornered. She called her friend Ashley, a lawyer who had once helped her through the custody case years ago. When Ashley heard the story, she didn't hesitate. "You're dealing with harassment," she said, And the HOA's covering for her because they're terrified of lawsuits. You need everything documented. Dates, times, pictures, messages. Make it airtight. For the first time in weeks, Lucia felt a spark of clarity. That night she started a file. She printed emails, saved screenshots, cataloged every letter. Each page became a brick in the wall she was building between herself and the chaos closing in. Then came the night of the cat's grave. Lucia woke to the sound of scratching outside, faint but deliberate. She looked out the window and saw movement near the oak tree where they had buried the animal. The flashlight beam cut across the yard for only a second, but it was enough to see the figure bending down, hands in the soil. She froze. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then anger overtook the fear, sharp and consuming. She grabbed her phone, hit record, and stormed outside barefoot. The cold grass stung her feet, but she didn't care. The figure froze when she shouted, "What are you doing?" Karen turned toward her, face pale, eyes wide under the glare of the phone's light. "I was checking your plants," she said, voice trembling but laced with sarcasm. "They smell strange. You could be contaminating the soil for everyone." Lucia stared at her, incredulous, shaking with rage. "Get off my property," she said through clenched teeth. "Now." Karen smirked, stepping backward but not breaking eye contact. "You really should learn to control that temper," she murmured. "It's not a good look for someone trying to fit in." The words hit their mark. Lucia stood there long after Karen disappeared into the night, her phone still recording the empty space where she'd stood. When she finally went inside, she locked every door and window, her breath shallow. She replayed the video again and again, the darkness swallowing the frame each time, the sound of her own heartbeat echoing through the speakers. By morning, she was too tired to feel anger, only a deep, cold certainty settling in her bones. The police still hadn't called back, the HOA hadn't acknowledged her complaint, and the neighbors avoided her as if she were contagious. Willow Creek had turned its back on her, but she would not be erased. As she stood at the kitchen window, staring at the ruined garden, she whispered to herself, not as a promise, but as a declaration. If they want to fight, I'll give them one. The reflection in the glass didn't look like the same woman who'd arrived months ago with hope in her heart and dirt on her hands. It looked like someone who had finally learned that peace, in places like this, was just another illusion waiting to be shattered. 3 weeks after hiring Trevor, Lauren's world had become a battlefield of paperwork, measured tones, and carefully chosen words that disguised open hostility. The cease and desist letter had been sent and formally received, stamped and signed by the HOA's legal department, but the park remained untouched. Each morning she woke to the sound of barking and laughter. Each afternoon brought a new wave of resentment. Trevor assured her that the legal process took time, but patience had never been her strength, and every day the park stood there felt like an insult carved into the soil. She had begun documenting everything, filling entire folders with photos, maps, receipts, and witness statements from neighbors who remembered the land being part of her father's property. Some were reluctant to get involved, glancing nervously toward the park before admitting in hushed voices that they had always known it belonged to the Brooks family. "They said you weren't coming back," one older man confessed quietly at the grocery store. "The HOA said the land was abandoned. I didn't think they'd go this far." His guilt lingered with her long after he walked away. Meanwhile, Trevor was digging through archives, calling in favors with clerks and land surveyors. One evening he called her with a tone that hinted at both triumph and disbelief. "You need to see this," he said. When she arrived at his office the next morning, he had a stack of old HOA meeting minutes spread across his desk, each page yellowed and printed with neat bureaucratic language. He pointed to a section dated 5 years earlier. "Right here," he said. The board discussed the possibility of temporarily utilizing the vacant Brooks lot for communal use pending owner verification. It was never meant to be permanent. They knew the land wasn't theirs. Lauren leaned over the table, reading the words again and again, her anger mounting with every line. They said, "Pending owner verification." "They knew I existed," she muttered. Trevor nodded. "They sent one letter to your father's old address after his death. Got no reply, and that was the end of it. Instead of contacting the estate or checking the county records, they just moved forward. Technically, that's a violation of state property law." For the first time since the ordeal began, Lauren felt hope tempered with purpose. There was proof, cold, undeniable evidence that the HOA had overstepped knowingly. But Trevor warned her not to celebrate yet. "They'll fight back," he said. "Expect deflection, false documents, maybe even harassment. People like this don't admit guilt easily." His prediction came true sooner than she expected. 2 days later, she found another notice taped to her door, claiming that her property was under review for code violations, including improper drainage and unauthorized fencing materials. It was absurd, given that the only fence standing was the one they had built, but it was a clear message. If she wanted to fight them, they would make her regret it. The following week brought the first official mediation session. Trevor advised her to stay calm, let him do most of the talking, and resist reacting to provocations. The meeting took place in a neutral office downtown, with a mediator present and 3 representatives from the HOA, including Sherry Clark herself. Sherry arrived early, perfectly composed, dressed in pale gray with a folder tucked under her arm. She greeted Lauren with the same polished smile, her tone dripping with condescension disguised as civility. "I'm glad we can discuss this like adults," she said sweetly. Lauren bit back the urge to respond. She sat across from Sherry, hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Trevor began presenting their documentation: the deed, the survey results, and the minutes from the HOA meeting that proved they had no legal right to occupy her land. Sherry's expression didn't waver, but the faint tightening of her jaw betrayed irritation. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned slightly forward, her voice honeyed and deliberate. "The association acted in good faith," she said. "At the time, the property was unclaimed and overgrown. The community needed a safe space for residents and their pets. We received no response from the Brooks family for years. It seemed reasonable to assume the land had been abandoned." Trevor interjected smoothly. "Reasonable assumption doesn't grant ownership, Ms. Clark. You had the means to verify title. You chose not to. Instead, you built permanent structures and profited from their use." Sherry's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We did what was best for the neighborhood. I understand Ms. Brooks has emotional attachments to the area, but emotions don't override the collective good." Lauren could feel her pulse pounding in her temples. "You stole from me," she said finally, her voice low and shaking. "You didn't build for the neighborhood. You built for yourselves. You didn't even ask." The mediator raised a hand gently. "Let's keep this professional," she said, but the room was already thick with tension. Sherry adjusted her papers and continued as if nothing had happened. "The community supports the park overwhelmingly. Removing it now would cause unnecessary disruption and resentment. We're open to discussing compensation or shared maintenance, but full reclamation simply isn't practical." Trevor gave a dry laugh. "You want to pay rent on stolen property? That's not generosity. That's damage control." Sherry's expression hardened for a fraction of a second before she recovered her composure. "We'll review our options," she said coolly. The mediation ended without resolution. As they left the building, Trevor muttered under his breath, "She's bluffing. They're hoping you'll take a payout and walk away." Lauren shook her head. "They used my husband's memory to rebuild my life here. I won't sell that for convenience." On the drive home, her anger boiled quietly beneath the surface, sharper than before, but colder too. She realized that Sherry's power came not from legality, but from manipulation, shaping perception, controlling narratives, convincing people that she was the villain standing in the way of progress. That night, Lauren logged onto the neighborhood's community forum, a place she had previously ignored. Her breath caught when she saw the posts, threads filled with comments, all about her. "Why is this woman trying to shut down our park?" one read. "Some people just hate community," said another. Someone even uploaded a picture of her standing near the fence, captioned, "Crazy lady wants to evict your dogs." The cruelty was staggering. She scrolled for what felt like hours, each comment a fresh sting. By midnight, the humiliation had curdled into fury. They wanted her to back down by turning her into a pariah, but they underestimated her resolve. The next morning she returned to Trevor's office with a new determination. "They're waging a PR war," she said, "so we'll do the same." Together they gathered every piece of proof they had, deeds, maps, meeting records, and contacted a local journalist known for investigating civic misconduct. Within a week, an article appeared online. "Private property turned public without owner consent. Oak Ridge HOA under scrutiny." The story spread fast. Comments flooded in, not all supportive but enough to shift the narrative. Some residents expressed shock, others demanded accountability. Sherry issued a statement dismissing the report as misinformation, but the damage had been done. For the first time, the HOA's facade of respectability began to crack. Lauren stood at her window that night, watching as the park lights flickered through the trees. The laughter sounded different now, thinner, uncertain, almost strained. A few people had stopped visiting after the news broke, and those who did came less frequently. Yet she knew this was only the midpoint, not victory. Sherry Clark wasn't the type to surrender quietly. She would regroup, retaliate, and strike where it hurt most. Lauren could almost feel the tension thickening in the air, like the stillness before a storm. But she no longer felt alone or unsure. The truth was on record. Her voice was finally being heard, and the line between her land and their arrogance had been drawn in ink that couldn't be erased. For the first time since this began, she understood that the fight wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about exposing a system that thrived on silence. And Lauren Brooks had decided she would never be silent again. The days following the hearing were eerily quiet, as if the entire neighborhood had sunk into a state of uneasy suspension, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was visible in the smallest gestures, the way curtains twitched when Lucia stepped outside, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence when she passed by. Even the air seemed different, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves had absorbed too much hostility to hold any more. Karen had disappeared from public view since that night, but Lucia could feel her presence everywhere, lingering like a toxin that refused to dissipate. She knew the silence was not surrender. It was retreat, the calm before another strike. And she was right. One afternoon, as she walked back from the mailbox, she noticed a bright yellow notice stapled to her front door. It was an official HOA complaint, signed by the same president who had barely met her eyes during the meeting. The document accused her of multiple violations, unauthorized alterations to property boundaries, improper waste disposal due to organic debris, and use of aggressive surveillance practices causing community distress. The irony made her laugh bitterly, but beneath the laughter was a knot of dread. Karen was still pulling strings, manipulating the board from behind the scenes, using the very rules she had broken to frame Lucia as the problem. Ashley came over that evening, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. Her expression darkened as she read. "They're fabricating grounds for expulsion," she said. "If they fine you enough times and you don't pay, they can try to place a lien on your property. That's how HOA harassment escalates. They drown you in bureaucracy until you give up." Lucia felt her throat tighten. "I'm not giving up," she said, almost whispering. Ashley nodded slowly, her eyes tired but resolute. "Then we'll fight every line. But I need you to be prepared. This is going to get uglier." That night, Lucia couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the garden now recovering after weeks of care and decontamination. The soil had begun to breathe again, faint shoots of green breaking through the brown. It was proof that life could return, even after poison. But as she watched, A figure moved in the shadows near the far end of the fence. She tensed, heart hammering, and reached for her phone. The figure lingered for a moment before slipping out of sight, but not before a faint metallic glint caught the moonlight. A camera flash. Someone was photographing her property. When she checked the HOA community page the next morning, she found her own backyard featured in a new post titled Environmental Hazards and Non-Compliant Residences, accompanied by grainy, zoomed-in images and comments from anonymous accounts suggesting her garden was attracting vermin and devaluing neighboring homes. The post had hundreds of views. The humiliation burned, but it was the violation that truly hollowed her out. Karen was no longer just tormenting her. She was orchestrating a campaign to erase her reputation, to turn the community's collective judgment into a weapon. Even Sophia began to feel it. One day after school, she came home quieter than usual, her backpack half unzipped. When Lucia asked what was wrong, she hesitated, then pulled out a crumpled flyer handed to students by a neighborhood parent committee. It included a polite but unmistakable warning about unsanctioned gardens posing health risks to local families. Lucia's name wasn't printed on it, but everyone knew who it was about. Sophia's eyes shimmered with confusion. "Did we do something bad, Mama?" she asked softly. Lucia hugged her tightly and whispered, "No, baby. We're just standing up for what's right." That evening, Ashley suggested filing a defamation claim and contacting local media. "They want to isolate you," she said. "Public exposure will shift the pressure." Lucia hesitated, knowing that once the story went public, there would be no turning back. But she also knew silence was exactly what Karen wanted. So she agreed. Within days, a local journalist arrived, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a notebook full of questions. He listened as Lucia described everything, from the poisoned soil to the smashed cameras, from the meetings to the anonymous harassment. He asked to see the footage and the reports, which she handed over without hesitation. "You realize," he said slowly, "if this goes live, it'll make enemies." Lucia smiled faintly. "I already have enemies. I just want the truth out there." The article was published 3 days later under the headline, "Toxic Power, HOA Member Accused of Harassment and Environmental Violations." The piece detailed her ordeal, naming the association but not Karen directly, citing ongoing investigation. Still, the impact was immediate. Neighbors began whispering again, but this time the tone was different, hesitant, uncertain, as if the illusion of moral authority had cracked. Some left flowers by her gate, anonymous gestures of solidarity. Others looked away in shame, but not everyone reacted kindly. Late that night, as she checked the locks, a heavy thud shook the porch. She opened the door to find a dead crow nailed to the wooden railing, its wings spread wide, its feathers glistening with blood. There was a note pinned beneath it, written in jagged letters, "Leave or rot." Lucia didn't call the police this time. She took pictures, sent them to Ashley, and cleaned it herself. Each scrape of the brush across the wood was an act of defiance. She refused to give Karen the satisfaction of fear, but the incident solidified something inside her, a shift from endurance to counterattack. She began gathering allies quietly, talking to the few neighbors who had also suffered under the HOA's selective enforcement. One elderly couple revealed that they'd been fined repeatedly for structural violations after refusing to donate to an HOA fundraiser led by Karen. Another neighbor whispered that his dog had fallen ill after drinking from a puddle near Karen's property. The stories multiplied, a pattern of quiet tyranny emerging from beneath the manicured perfection of Willow Creek. Ashley worked tirelessly behind the scenes, compiling testimony and cross-referencing HOA budgets with public filings. What she uncovered was explosive: unauthorized expenditures, falsified invoices, and payments to a landscaping company that didn't exist. "It's a shell," Ashley said one night over the phone. "Karen's been laundering HOA funds through fake maintenance contracts. That's why she's desperate to silence you. Lucia listened in stunned silence, the weight of it settling like a storm cloud. They weren't just dealing with a malicious neighbor. They were exposing corruption that could dismantle the entire association. The next day, Lucia received a letter from the county clerk's office. Karen had filed a restraining order against her, claiming harassment and emotional distress, supported by fabricated evidence, including edited screenshots of online posts and distorted photos. It was a desperate move, but it meant one thing: Karen was losing control. Ashley reassured her that the order would never hold up in court, but the stress was palpable. Lucia found herself pacing the house late at night, lights off, ears tuned to every creak and rustle. Sleep became a luxury she no longer trusted. Then, one dawn, as pale light spread across the sky, she noticed something unusual. The HOA truck, a white van with the association's emblem, was parked by her driveway. Two men in uniforms were unloading bins labeled soil treatment. She stepped outside, demanding to know what they were doing. One of them, barely glancing up, muttered that they were conducting safety remediation as per community directive. Lucia froze. No such directive existed. Ashley had warned her the board couldn't act without consent on private property. When she threatened to call the police, the men hastily packed their tools and drove off, leaving behind a faint trail of oily residue on the grass. It was a message, and she understood it perfectly. They were reminding her that even when they lost, they could still invade. As she stood there watching the van disappear, the early sun glinting off the poisoned earth, Lucia felt something inside her shift from fear to resolve so sharp it almost hurt. They had taken her peace, her safety, and her trust in the system, but they hadn't taken her will. She walked back into the house, pulled out the folder Ashley had prepared, and looked at the stack of evidence, photos, statements, financial records, all pointing to the truth. The next step would not be another plea or report. It would be a reckoning. And as the wind rustled through the wounded garden outside, she whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "You wanted a war, Karen. Now you have one." The morning of the hearing dawned gray and windless, the kind of oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow every sound before it could form. Lucia had not slept. She sat at the kitchen table long after sunrise, her eyes fixed on the folder before her. The same folder she and Ashley had built piece by piece, now thick with everything they had gathered. Every photograph, report, and testimony sat inside it, like the weight of months of fear compressed into paper. She wasn't afraid anymore, not exactly. The fear had calcified into something colder, sharper. When Ashley arrived, dressed in a dark suit and carrying her own stack of files, Lucia felt a strange calm settle over her. It was the clarity that came when there was nothing left to lose. The courthouse was smaller than she imagined, almost humble, its pale walls lined with the dull echo of footsteps and murmurs. Inside the chamber, the air smelled of paper and tension. Karen was already there, her hair immaculate, her face carefully painted into a mask of innocence. She sat beside her lawyer, a man whose confidence radiated like cheap perfume. Around them were a few board members from the HOA, their expressions tight and unreadable. Lucia took her seat beside Ashley without looking at them. She could feel Karen's gaze like static against her skin. The judge entered, an older woman with a sharp, assessing look that cut through the room's nervous energy. When the proceedings began, Karen's attorney spoke first, weaving a narrative of persecution. He described Lucia as erratic, confrontational, unstable, a woman whose personal fixation on horticulture had escalated into paranoia and defamation. Karen kept her expression poised, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a tissue as if the ordeal were unbearable. Lucia listened silently, her jaw clenched, her fingers digging into the folder beneath the table. It was surreal to hear her life twisted into something grotesque and false, but she refused to flinch. Then it was Ashley's turn. Her voice was calm, but carried a quiet force that filled the room. She began by presenting the timeline, methodical and relentless, every event backed by documentation. The photos of the poisoned garden, the lab results confirming banned chemicals, the footage of Karen in the act, all laid out in sequence until the pattern was undeniable. The courtroom projector flickered as the video played. Karen crouched near the basil patch, the faint glow of the flashlight on her face, the deliberate scattering motion of her hand. When the frame froze on her smirk before she turned toward the camera, a ripple went through the audience. Karen's lawyer rose, objecting loudly, claiming invasion of privacy, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "This evidence is relevant," she said coolly. "Please continue." Ashley did not stop there. She introduced the financial documents, the irregular transfers tied to the fictitious landscaping company, the HOA's discretionary fund diverted into private accounts. The numbers spoke for themselves. The judge's expression hardened as she flipped through the pages, glancing briefly at the trembling board members. "So," Ashley said finally, her tone measured but cutting, "while my client was being fined, harassed, and publicly defamed for growing herbs in her backyard, the HOA leadership was quietly funneling community funds into personal ventures, and the person at the center of every decision, every fabricated complaint, every punitive action, was Mrs. Whitfield." For the first time, Karen broke composure. Her hand slammed against the table as she hissed, "That's a lie!" The judge's gavel struck sharply, echoing through the chamber. "You will remain silent, Mrs. Whitfield, unless spoken to." The mask was cracking, and the truth poured through the fractures. Ashley continued, presenting testimony from the neighbors who had finally stepped forward after the article. People who had suffered under Karen's reign of control and fear, but were too intimidated to speak until now. Each story layered upon the next, until the picture was complete. Years of manipulation, intimidation, and deceit, all wrapped in the pretense of community service. By the time the judge called for recess, the outcome was already written on the walls. Lucia stepped outside for air, the courthouse courtyard buzzing with whispers. Reporters were there now. Someone must have tipped them off. She saw the flash of cameras and heard her name called, but she ignored them. She stood under a leafless tree, her heart pounding, realizing how surreal it was that her quiet life had become a spectacle of justice. Ashley joined her, handing her a bottle of water. "You did good," she said softly. Lucia shook her head. "I didn't do anything. I just stopped hiding." When the court reconvened, the judge's decision was swift and merciless. The restraining order against Lucia was dismissed as fraudulent. The evidence of environmental damage and financial misconduct was referred to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Karen's membership in the HOA was terminated effective immediately, and the association was ordered to compensate Lucia for damages and legal costs. As the words were spoken, Lucia felt something uncoil inside her, like a thread that had been pulled taut for too long finally released. Across the room, Karen sat frozen, her lawyer whispering frantically in her ear while her face drained of color. When the session adjourned, the board members avoided Lucia's eyes as they filed out. Karen stood motionless for a long moment before finally rising. Her voice trembled as she said, "You think you've won, but people like you never belong here. You'll always be." She didn't finish. Ashley stepped between them, her tone cool as ice. "That's enough." Karen turned sharply and stormed out, her heels striking the marble floor like gunshots fading down the hall. Lucia didn't move. She stood in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the fading murmur of justice finally served. There was no triumph, only a strange, aching stillness, the kind that follows a storm when the air is too heavy to breathe. As she gathered her papers, she looked at the judge's bench one last time and thought of everything the word home had meant before it was turned into a battlefield. It would never be the same, but maybe that was all right. The garden outside her house would bloom again, and this time its roots would carry something stronger than peace. They would carry proof that survival itself could be an act of defiance. The weeks that followed felt like the slow uncoiling of a wound that had been festering for too long. The air in Willow Creek changed in ways that only silence could measure. The sharp tension that had hung over the cul-de-sac dissolved, leaving behind something gentler, humbler. Karen's house stood empty, its blinds drawn, the once perfectly trimmed hedges already beginning to overgrow, nature reclaiming what had been forced into symmetry. Rumors said she had sold the property at a loss and moved out of state while the investigation into HOA funds continued. The board, stripped of its old arrogance, held emergency elections and appointed a temporary committee to rebuild what was left of their credibility. They reached out to Lucia with a formal apology, but she didn't attend the meeting or reply to their emails. She had no interest in apologies written out of fear. Her peace no longer depended on their approval. Instead, she turned her attention back to the garden. The soil had been tested, treated, and left to rest for weeks, and now it was ready to breathe again. One morning, as the light spread softly across the yard, Lucia and Sophia knelt side by side, planting new rows, basil and mint, lavender and marigolds, and a small patch of strawberries in the same place where the old ones had withered. The rhythm of their work was quiet and steady, the scrape of shovels and the whisper of roots being covered again by clean earth. The air smelled of rain and renewal. For the first time in months, Lucia felt her shoulders loosen, her heartbeat finding its rhythm not in fear, but in calm purpose. Sophia hummed as she worked, a tune Lucia didn't recognize, but one that sounded like hope. Neighbors began stopping by, not all, but enough to matter. Some brought seedlings, others just words. An elderly woman from 2 houses down offered compost, murmuring that she admired Lucia's courage. Another neighbor apologized for staying silent for too long. Lucia accepted it all without bitterness. She had learned that courage wasn't about fighting loudly. Sometimes it was about enduring quietly until the noise around you destroyed itself. When the garden was finally complete, Sophia painted a small wooden sign and planted it at the edge of the path. In bright green letters it read, "This place grows only kindness." Lucia smiled when she saw it. That evening, she sat on the porch watching the light fade behind the rooftops. The new board had announced reforms, transparency rules, open financial audits, and a community mediation process, but she didn't read the details. The fight had cost her too much to celebrate bureaucracy. What mattered was the stillness of her home, the gentle rustle of leaves, the faint hum of bees returning to the lavender. For the first time since moving here, she felt the house breathe with her again. The wounds in the soil would heal, the fear that once tainted the air would fade, and even if the world around her remained imperfect, her small corner of it had reclaimed its right to peace. She glanced toward the horizon where the last light burned gold and whispered to herself, not as a prayer, but as a promise, that no one would ever take it from her again.